Welcome, this is Magnus speaking, and I've been away for a while, and I have actually worked on a couple of things for Samsung, to be honest, throughout this time that I've been taking off. But today's video is not about any of that. We're going to focus on something else. Today we're going to talk about the recently announced Sony A9 Mark III. Now this camera's got a lot of specs, but today I'm going to focus in on the global shutter itself and why I still have questions about this camera that need answering. And you guys definitely need to ask these questions too before jumping on this camera. I'm sure it won't be that bad, but we're going to talk about this. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, Sony A9III recently was announced at a $6,000 price tag. Now this camera can shoot 24.6 megapixel pictures at up to 120 frames per second raw, though compressed. It also has pre-capture functions so that you can get pictures before you even hit the shutter, and flash sync up to an amazing 1 out of 80,000th speed. On the video perspective, it does 4K at 120 frames per second, no crop, 10-bit video with S-Log 3 and S-Cinetone, and it does 4K 60 as well. Now, when you think about this and you think about these settings and you think about the fact that it also has 8 stops of image stabilization, which is amazing. In a video perspective, you want to consider the fact that with a global shutter, you will get no rolling shutter when you're actually filming video. And with pictures, you won't have that rolling shutter effect either. It's amazing that you get a global readout. So a lot of people have been asking for this, and Sony actually did it. But what are the classic concerns with a global shutter, and why haven't other manufacturers done this? Well, technology is one of the reasons, but there are other limitations or struggles that having a global shutter would traditionally put you in. And I have these questions for this camera and for reviewers when it's actually released, because then we'll be able to see how well this actual sensor does. Now, I have no doubt that it will actually be a pretty good sensor, and they've gotten past a lot of these limitations. But how far have they come? One of the first challenges of global shutter is the complexity of building them and the cost. Now, this is why this camera is $6,000, amongst other reasons. But a $6,000 camera, it cannot be any cheaper than that, because a sensor that is a global shutter is traditionally more expensive. And that's why it really wasn't an option for many years. Another problem with global shutters is the reduced sensitivity to light. Now, Sony is known for being a low light king, but traditionally global shutters have a harder time in low light situations. So how well is the low light performance on this camera? I have not seen any videos, at least right now yet, because it's still too early, that show how good of an ISO performance this does, especially in higher ISOs. Now, granted, I'm sure Sony must have figured something out for this camera, but traditionally, you might get a lot of noise in low ISOs if you're using the global shutter. Speaking of how it picks up images, the other things that global shutters have always had a problem with is dynamic range. Traditionally, Sony advertises that they do up to 15 stops of dynamic range in other cameras. Now, with a global shutter, it's usually not the case. And that's always been a traditional problem with global shutters. So I would like to know, what is the dynamic range of this camera? Will we get 15 stops or a hair below? I'd like to know. Now, another problem with global shutters is the resolutions and frame rates that it can handle. Now, we do know the frame rate of 120 frames per second when it comes to even 4K video or even pictures. And we know the resolution is just under 25 megapixels. So that in itself makes sense that it's not shooting at higher megapixels. But honestly, this is something that Sony seems to have addressed with their frame rate. And the resolution at just under 25 is not that bad. And you can get actually 6K footage downsampled to 4K from this sensor. So I don't think that this usual concern with global shutters is an issue here. But those that wanted 8K video, you're not going to get it on this camera. Another concern with a global shutter is the increased heat creation with a shutter like this. Now, I would like to see how long this camera can last in its different video modes and even picture modes before it overheats, if it overheats at all. Sony has done a pretty good job of controlling their heat dissipation from their cameras, And I assume that this camera will no doubt be able to perform pretty well under high heat situations where you're recording for longer periods of time or taking pictures. But we don't know, so we have yet to find out. Another thing is the battery life. How long will the battery life last? Because again, a global shutter is going to consume traditionally more power. So what is the battery life, and will it actually be a hair or two lower than most Sony cameras released nowadays? Now, another thing with global shutters, usually they need a bigger body because of that heat, but it looks like Sony has been able to maintain a relatively normal sized body because they like to make pretty small camera bodies. And that seems to be a result. But then again, we got to look back at, will the overheating be an issue on this camera? And one issue that I guess we'll find out one way or another is that usually global shutters, at least, I don't know what the factory situation is, but global shutters are actually of limited availability when it comes to creation. Now, if they're making a lot of these sensors, hopefully anyone who wants one can get their hands on one. But will everybody have to wait a long time as pre-orders fill super fast? We don't know. Anyway, those are my concerns, technically like 8 concerns that I have over this camera and the global shutter. Let me know if you have any type of concerns with this type of camera. And of course, as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys later.